I was cut off in the last video I made because the dog started to fight with another dog, or another dog started to fight with them, I should say. But what I was talking about was capacity, and that stemmed from this thinking about this quote from Mark Johnson, where he says that our capacity for thought and meaning emerges from, I beg your pardon, meaning and thought emerge from our capacity for perception, object manipulation and bodily movement. And what I got onto was talking about his use of this word capacity. So even though he doesn't explicitly say that that's part of his schema, I think it is. The space in which this perception, movement and manipulation takes place is a kind of volumetric capacity, and it's kind of mapped onto the space of lived experience. At least that's how I'm understanding it. So that the variables that we have in the three-dimensional space that we seem to be embedded within act as variables within the entailments of that as a metaphor. So different types of meaning, different types of knowledge can be ascribed to different kinds of spatial relations, different spatial locations and relationships. I've said all that stuff before, really. But what I wanted to go on to talk about was this idea of capacity itself. And I think what I just managed to mumble at the end of the last video was that this term capacity was one that was used by the, I think, 17th or 18th century Christian mystic of sorts, Thomas Traherne, I've read a little bit about. And he's talking about kind of enlightenment experiences, and it has a kind of Christian gloss on it, but it's not a standard Christianity by any means. And the experiences he seems to be recounting are much more like the sort of experiences you associate with a non-theistic religious practice like Buddhism or something like that. And he's talking about capacity as a kind of inhabiting of space, inhabiting of an identification with the space of thought, really. That's how I'm interpreting it. A kind of mystical union with the space in which knowledge and meaning and thought takes place, rather than the usual identification we have when we talk about meaning and knowledge and thought, which is, as Mark Johnson says, to do with objects, and to do with movements, and to do with perceptual sets, that kind of thing. Traherne, as I say, seems to be associating with the space of thought. I mentioned Buddhism in passing because I know that in some Buddhist practices this kind of association with space. There's a lovely little pamphlet I was given once called Knowing Space, which is about a kind of meditative practice where one kind of tries to feel the space around oneself and feel oneself extend into space and develop an affinity or a relationship with space, both occupied and unoccupied space, rather than being object-centered. So I think it's interesting that this capacity that Traherne talks about, he associates it very much with mystical practice. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think the fact that it is really interesting. And also I think the fact that it seems to coincide with lots of metaphors to do with light and visibility and luminance and lucidity. Those kind of terms, as if what Traherne seems to be doing there. And I think you also find glimmers of it in Douglas Harding's writing and one or two other people, Ren Lewis, for example. You also find this either ignoring or suppression or erasing of concerns with objects and concerns with perceptions and concerns with bodily movement, almost an ignoring of a particular bodily location in space from which those perceptions, movements and manipulations might arise. an ignoring of those in favour of an identification just with the space itself, this brightly lit, lucid space. Quite interesting.